أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I begin, as I always begin, in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. I ask Allah's forgiveness for any errors that I might make through the frailty of being human. Well, let's talk about sex. Oh, it is so exciting for me to have this opportunity to talk with these editors of Sex Talk, which is very comprehensive book. And if I start talking about it now, I will not get to my usual format. So I'm going to try to rein myself in. Instead, I'm going to introduce the editors one by one and let them chat with us a little bit about their life journey. And then we're just going to dive into the book for as much time as we have remaining. Okay, so Nadia Mohajir is a lifelong Chicagoan, Pakistani American Muslim, mother of three, public health professional, reproductive justice activist, and anti-sexual assault advocate. She is the co-founder and co-executive director for HEART, H-E-A-R-T, an acronym, Women and Girls. For over a decade, she has led the organization to provide sexual health education and sexual violence awareness programming and advocacy to thousands of individuals, organizations, and campuses across the country. Nadia has worked in public health and reproductive justice for over 20 years in a variety of settings, including, but not limited to, research, academics, policy, and community health. Her past work includes projects such as redesigning teen pregnancy programs, improving pregnancy outcomes in low-income communities in Chicago, running sex education programming for vulnerable youth, and evaluating innovative cross-sector partnerships in public health. She earned her master's degree in public health in 2009 from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and her bachelor program in public policy studies from the University of Chicago. Nadia has also participated in a number of fellowships, including the American Muslim Civic Leaders Institute, German NACO's Fellowship, sorry if I didn't get that right, is a recipient of the Women's Innovation Fund, and most recently was selected to participate in a Novo Foundation's Move to End Violence program. She's also the recipient of numerous awards, including 2018 Chicago Foundation for Women's Impact Award and the El Hibri Foundation Community Builder Award. Nadia, please, can we introduce yourself?
Thank you so much for inviting me, Dr. Wadud, today. It's just such an honor to be here, especially with my two co-authors, Nabila and Hadi. You know, I always get embarrassed when my bio is read, but as you know, I'm a mom first and foremost, and I think that that's what kind of informs a lot of the work that I do. And yeah, like my story is really rooted in my own experiences with sex ed and not being able to relate to, you know, the sex ed that I had access to through mainstream spaces. And basically I felt as myself and my colleagues, or not my colleagues, my peers, at that time I was not working, as my peers started navigating the world and life and relationships and dating and violence, I realized that there were two questions that were not being asked, two very, very critical questions that were not being asked that were really important. And that is, are you being safe and do you feel safe? And the reason that, I feel that those questions were not asked quite often is because, it's a combination of, being in denial about the reality of what Muslims have to navigate and those issues don't impact Muslims. We're all Muslim, we don't do that. And then also another combination, and combined with a level of shame and stigma for those who felt like they needed to navigate those experiences and didn't have a safe place to sort of talk to safe people and get advice. And so that's sort of how my journey began as a young person, like as early as 15, 16. And my work experiences just kind of took me down this journey of ultimately founding this organization, Heart, which is now a national organization that's working at the intersection of reproductive justice, gender-based violence in Muslim communities in particular. And we're doing so in a way that's very intersectional and really centers the most directly impacted Muslims, both from lived experience as well as with respect to their identities and all the numerous ways that Muslims are marginalized.
Wow, thank you for being brief. Your bio indicates a fascinating trajectory, so I will delve into that a little bit more as we go along. Nabila Rashid is a Muslim queer Bangladeshi American. She is a trauma-informed forensic social worker and community educator. She joined Heart in 2019 full-time and is the manager of training and survivor advocacy. Before Heart, Nabila was consulting for public defenders, government agency staff, and nonprofits to support in creating safer spaces for victims and survivors, either through organizing programming or one-on-one case management. Nabila also co-founded the Cathartic Artists, I assume, the Cathartis in 2012, a web-based platform for victims and survivors, allies, and co-conspirators to find a safe, judgment-free home for their storytelling as part of their journey on coping and healing. Nabila is also featured as a survivor in the award-winning documentary Breaking Silence, where she addresses the nuances and experiences of being a survivor of sexual violence in a Muslim and South Asian community and the journey toward healing. She earned her master's in social work from Long Island University, Brooklyn, a postbaccalaureate degree in biology from University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and a bachelor's of science in health science and creative writing from University of Sciences in Philadelphia. Nabila, please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. Every time a bio is read, I always forget that I need to send like a shorter bio, but thank you so much for reading that entire bio. It's interesting when you said cathartic artist, because that's actually exactly how we came up with the cathartist. And that really truly is the beginning of my professional journey. I actually didn't know if I was going to go into this field. And at the time that the cathartist had started, I was thinking, oh, let me stay in healthcare. Let me like try to become a doctor. But that idea quickly ended very, very, very quickly by myself. So I essentially started to kind of go into social work because a lot of my experiences being Muslim and South Asian and being a survivor, I just never felt that community, specifically the Muslim community, to be able to speak to someone, to be able to get support from someone. And so a lot of my healing in the beginning started with the storytelling piece through that particular platform. And that really catapulted into my education, where I really delved much deeper through social work and understanding, okay, so in terms of pedagogy, like how does this work? How can I actually create spaces for survivors? How do I create spaces for individuals that may be just like me and don't know where to go for support? And this was like 15, maybe like 13 years ago, 13, 14 years ago. Like what is time? I don't know anymore, but it's been a while. And through that journey, I was in so many different types of nonprofits and very different spaces as well that were immersed in gender-based violence. But one thing that kept missing was that Muslim piece, the piece where I felt very rooted to Islamic traditions and Islamic values, which I just didn't feel like I could shine. And I felt like Nadia, and like through so many different pathways, we actually connected virtually. And from there, also because of the film, that doing the work of working with survivors, and figuring out how do I bring the Islam piece into it. And then with that being said, I was also doing a lot of work with people who harm. So abusers, sex offenders, people generally that, you know, that we clump into that category. And so for me as a survivor, it was really important to kind of figure out, well, how do I make sense of the people who have harmed me? Maybe not the exact specific people, but like people who harm, period. How do we humanize them? Because to me, it didn't make sense for me to do the work of trying to create safer spaces for survivors and doing prevention work without thinking about prevention that also included accountability of people who harm. So long story short, I'm now with Heart and we're doing such incredible work, a lot of looking at the bigger picture and thinking about how do we stay rooted in the community? How do we work alongside community? Because that's really where a lot of that deep storytelling, narrative sharing, and like really understanding where the void in resources, language, what have you is. So super excited to be here.
Wow, I'm so excited to have you. And next we have Hadi Cisse. Hadijatu Cisse is a Gambian Muslim researcher, writer, and social justice advocate with expertise and significant experience in research, project management, and advocacy, primarily focusing on education policy, youth empowerment, public health, and gender. She holds a doctorate from City University of London, where her research centered on sexual and reproductive health education policy for young people. She has extensive experience working with survivors of various forms of gender-based violence, GBV, including female genital mutilation, FGM, child marriages, and sexual violence. Dr. Cisse is a health educator and consultant at Heart and has consulted for other agencies, including the United Nations Population Fund, the Institute for Human Rights and Development in Africa, and the Population Council. Prior to this, she was part of an interagency committee that worked with African Union's campaign to end child marriages and successfully lobbied to pass a law to ban child marriage in the Gambia. Dr. Cisse co-founded the Save Gambian Women Initiative, hashtag Save Gambian Women, an online repository for documenting violence against women cases in the Gambia. She's a firm believer of activism through digital spaces for the global amplification of women's voices. Please, Dr. Cisse.
Hi. First of all, I would like to say thank you so much for having us here. It's very much an honor. And also, just like with what Navila and Nadia said, it's always so weird when someone reads out your bio because it's like, oh, I did that. But yeah, so a little bit about myself. I've been working with Heart now for like 5, 6 years or more. I've kind of lost track, but it started off with like just so I've always, from my bio, I've always just been interested in work around gender issues, around sexuality issues, and so on and so forth. And I think I've been curious since I was a kid, but like growing up Gambian and just being raised in a Gambian household, any kinds of talk around sex and sexuality was very, very taboo. So I growing up, I felt like, okay, the only way that I could, do anything around sex and sex ed in general would be maybe like going to med school and becoming an OBGYN. That's the only way I thought I could help girls and women. And then I, started college, and then my first public health class we talked about sex ed, and that was like my first like major exposure to like any kind of sex education, and I just thought it was the coolest thing ever. And I was like, oh, actually this is what I want to do. I don't want to go to med school, this is cooler. So so yeah, that led me to, you know, meeting a bunch of different people and just learning that there were different ways to help girls and women, which led me to like meeting a friend in college who was already working with Nadia and Heart. And just knowing my passions and everything, and knowing Nadia, she thought that it would be the best thing, you know, for me to connect with Nadia and see how whether or not I would be interested in any kind of work Heart was doing. And it was literally like love at first sight. So it's been a wonderful partnership, and it's just been a way to grow so much personally and just in the work that I've been doing as well. But yeah, I think that is it.
Thank you, ladies, for being briefer than I was anticipating in terms of the personal bio, but that just means we get to talk about sex talk. First of all, I feel I want to say a little bit about, you know, how excited I was reading it. I think number one for me, because I am currently working on this initiative for queer Islamic studies and theology, I was really impressed with the inclusiveness of the language. Even the visuals are inclusive and diverse. And the ease with which that inclusiveness happens for such a still sensitive topic such as sex and, you know, about sex education, the ease with which that was done was something that was really awesome and impressive for me, because actually, like just last week, another scholar friend of mine wrote me and said, you know, how do you make your first book published 30 years ago trans inclusive? And I thought, oh my God, I think it's so important, but I just cannot imagine that my life is going to be, I'm going to go back and correct all the sort of binary assumptions that I might have been running with at that time, given that I'm still doing work now. But it's so important, you know. So anyway, it is an important part of talking about reproductive health, sex, and issues related to sexual health, to not just make that binary heterodominant kind of assumption. And so that's one of the things that I found like really impressive, you know, in reading through it. I also want to say that although I'm 70 years old and 3 times retired, I learned a lot. And I think probably the last comment I want to make about it before I ask you some particular questions with regard to the book is the section talking about the various forms of marriages, where you make a distinction between secrecy and deception. Wow, that was just like eye-opening for me, because, you know, that's an experience that, you know, I myself have had. You know, there's a discrepancy between whether or not you want something just because of respect for privacy, and whether or not you do something because actually there's a person in there who wants to deceive in many ways. So thank you for that. That was like super enlightening. That's going to be my Pisces new moon kind of like, you know, gifts from Allah that, you know, I finally finished the book last night because I read in over time. About the book, I think I'm going to start with Nadia, simply because of the longevity of your participation in this, and also because you're the founder and creator of Heart. What was, I can understand the motivation just looking at your life work, but I really want to kind of help us, in terms of people who might watch this, help us understand a little bit about the process. So what was the process that you went through in order to bring this to fruition?
Yeah, thank you. So I think it needs to be named that this book literally took probably a good portion of 7 years to actually come to completion. It's been rewritten more times than I can count anymore. Like, I can find so many drafts on my computer that are like, oh, oh, that's what it used to look like before we got it to what it is now. It's been, we named this in the introduction or in the beginning and also at the end that, more than 20 people contributed to this book in some way, whether it was giving us feedback or the three of us who wrote it, Dr. Asifa Qureshi, who was our beloved editor. And so, I think what I want to name is I really truly believe that this book is a culmination of Heart's work, and the stories that we've collected over time. And so literally it, since the beginning, when we started back in 2010, to, 2022, when it was released, this book represents, I mean, we were editing, Hadi and Navila are my witness. We were editing till like literally the day before it went to print, because I was like, oh, but we have to do this. And what about this? And, we're already talking about edition 2 and, and things like that. And so it's, since 2010, we've been collecting so many stories, that are reflected in this book, stories of sexual dysfunction, stories of folks not knowing where their body parts are, or even the names of their body parts, stories about people not knowing the mechanics of sex, stories about people struggling with their sexuality and, same-sex attraction and same-sex relationships, stories about violence, so much violence, sexual violence, domestic violence, spiritual violence, that we really wanted to create a resource. And initially, we were approached by our friends at Love Inshallah, and their vision was, oh, we just want a little pocketbook. Like, we just want people to just basically put it in their back pocket and pull it out. And once we started working on the project, I was like, oh no, like we can't, like, no, like we have to do this and we have to do this and we have to do this and we have to include this. And, because there was we started with surveying the community and collecting responses about what they wanted in this book. And it ranged from, straight up biological information on, anatomy and contraception and, sexually transmitted infections to, more complicated and nuanced things about violence and consent and all the different kinds of relationships there are. And so, we really wanted to do that justice. And I think our final iteration of the book emerged when, it was a reflection that we all did together about like, well, what makes Heart? What is the core of our essence of our work? And that is that we have this really innovative ability to merge, best practice in public health education with Islamic values, and basically show folks that this work is not only not in conflict with Islam, but it is inherently Islamic. And the ways in which we did that was grounding ourselves in, core Islamic values. So we have a framework on healthy relationships that we offer. And it is based on the Arabic word rida, which means fullness of choice. And we like to think of that as a very beautiful way to describe consent. And each of those letters, like, so as you mentioned in my bio, Heart is an acronym. We love acronyms. So each of those letters is actually, it describes what a healthy relationships, whether it's a sexual one or not, right? Is how, like, each of those letters describe what it should be, and it's rooting itself in words like rahma, in ilm, which is knowledge, adala, equity and fairness, horma, safety of from violence. And so it really offers a framework for folks to really assess their own relationships if they're in one, or use it as a decision-making tool if they're about to embark on a relationship, and to say, like, does this relationship kind of meet this criteria? And it takes it beyond halal and haram. Like, we can beat a dead horse, till we're blue in the face about halal and haram. It's still not giving people the tools that they need to actually make informed decisions for themselves and for their bodies. And so we wanted to take the conversation beyond permissibility and talk about what does an ethical relationship look like? What what are sexual ethics? What does it look like to be in a full, fulfilling, thriving, consensual relationship? You know, and yes, we did do it in a way that was inclusive because we wanted to name the fact that Muslims have a very, very wide range of experiences when it comes to sexual health, sexual relationships. And, you know, we have like from dating to being married to being polygamous to being in same-sex relationships, right? And so we wanted to be able to kind of name all of those different types of relationships and be like, we know these happen. And we can discuss the haram and halal till we're blue in the face, but that doesn't really give people who are experiencing that in their real lives any tangible tools to actually feel safe and informed.
Wow. Yeah, I can feel all of that, you know, in terms of reading it. I love the Rida as, you know, way to sort of think about consent, and also we are locked into halal haram ad nauseum, whereas in this particular area, there is so much that is happening, and it's happening every day, and it's even happening to children in terms of like different levels of sexual maturation, you know, in their teens and everything. So how do we make sure that it's comprehensive? I feel like I was impressed with Navila introducing a motivation for her that is simultaneously, are you being safe and do you feel safe? In particular, in terms of like compositions of, you know, the chapters as they unfold in this book, how difficult did you feel that it was kind of like confirmed by, you know, the way that the book unfolds, like those two questions? How did you have to toggle between the two? Were there places that you felt that it didn't happen sufficiently, and that there was, you know, some sliding? And then, you know, how would you guys as a team, you know, how would you work those out?
That's such a great question. And we definitely had to come across that several times. I mean, again, 7 years in the making and so many different iterations. It was just going to happen. I know for me personally, as someone who wrote different parts of the book, that question of, are you feeling safe and are you safe? I mean, as someone who's queer and like literally came out much later in life, I'm like 33, and Muslim and South Asian, like all like the wonderful, you know, mocktail of things. And for me, it was really hard because I had to ask myself several times, like, whoa, I'm writing this particular section. I didn't feel safe at a certain time. I might not feel safe now. So how do I write this part? Right? Especially when I know it's going to be super integral for other people that are going to pick up the book and say, I need this and I needed this right now. Right? Like maybe not even in the past, but like right now, I need this. So it was a lot emotionally to have to put myself in that space of, I might not feel safe right now. So how do we cultivate language around certain sections of the book that can create that for people while being reflective, while asking questions, while challenging people, like what they're conditioned to believe about certain ideas, or like even some of their, you know, beliefs about certain things that are just problematic, just because of the world that we live in. And so I think for us as a team, in terms of confronting the things that we even wrote, how do we make it make sense, and how do we do it in the way that it's meaningful and that it's grounded back in our Islamic values that we were consistently trying to highlight throughout the entire book? I know that it wasn't just like Nadia, Hadi, and myself. We were bringing in external folks, and Nadia mentioned this earlier, but we have literally over 50 people that were part of this process. And one of our biggest things was really thinking about, how are we going back to Islamic scholarship that is not being headed by cis hetero Muslim men, right? But like being headed by or led by female scholars or queer scholars or like scholars of color, right? Because that is what is much more resonant of how we wanted to continue to be inclusive. And also thinking back, okay, so are we writing something in a way that's ethical, in a way that's, you know, that's factually accurate, in a way that's actually useful? Because I think oftentimes what happens is sometimes people, when they're thinking about us as an organization, or like not even just us, but like see Muslims and they think we're religious. But this book, what it's really not trying to do is share things on fiqh, right? We're not talking about fiqh. We're not giving any type of like, oh, and Nadia mentioned this, right? We're not saying this is haram or halal. It's not a religious treatise or anything of that nature. So really having us pull back and say, how do we do it in a way that's not urging people to like kind of settle into that? Because I think it's really easy for Muslims and even myself, as I wrote this book, it was a learning process for me too, where I'm like, I never really questioned this because growing up, I was just told that I need to believe it, which in one sense, it's nice and beautiful. But in another sense, it could be really, really harmful, especially if those beliefs and, you know, those practices are just not aligned or not in alignment with ilm, or like the seeking of knowledge and like being critical and having that analysis. So that's one of the things that we really try to do, is pose questions that could have folks really be analytical about their lives and the ways in which they engage with people. And it doesn't, again, have to be a romantic encounter with someone, but really familial, platonic, a relationship, or like a, you know, engaging with a coworker, being a caretaker, all of that, right? Like the nuances of how relationships show up. So it was really thinking about, well, what do we envision to be safe? How do we envision being safe? And how do we feel safe? And really trying to reflect that in the book through tons of reflections, not only for the folks that are going to pick it up, but also even for ourselves. And we try to also input that in a lot of our trainings and workshops and resources that we are continuously pushing out.
Yeah, I can imagine that it's a question that has to be asked over and over again. I think I mentioned that, you know, when I have a gallery here, I present 3 tiers that allow people to participate while at the same time, you know, observing their own levels of safety. And my queer Islamic studies and theology, which is also an acronym because GIST means applied justice. You know, I tell people the only reason why you have to subscribe is because we need some way to make sure that people who are entering and they will respect the safety and, you know, privacy of other people. And if we just, you know, have your email, you know, that kind of lets us have some control over it, because you're vulnerable when you're in the public space and when you're talking about certain topics. And yet, if we don't talk about those topics, I'm sure you all will agree, they can cause all kinds of harm and they can do violence. Hadi, I really like the way you decided that it wasn't medicine. It wasn't, you know, OBGYN, that instead it was like sexual education. Can you tell me just like a little bit about, well, first of all, this book is very informative. I think I would need to step away from it, you know, after 2 or 3 reads before I could find something that I think is missing. But I feel it's a wonderful educational tool, including the fact that, you know, after you do the particular chapters, you have different types of situated questions. You know, that's just brilliant, you know. So I kind of want to ask Andy about, how did you guys decide on, you know, formatting both the content within a chapter and then the reference section, which is also so rich, and then this kind of like, you know, education is not a one-way, it's not a one-directional thing, so you have to have people reflect on what they've done. And the best way to reflect, especially with a topic like this, is with the embodied reference. I'm sorry, like I'm giving you an answer, but in any case, I just am just sort of, you know, springboarding off of your own internal transformation from medicine, which is still necessary and inclusive, to sexual education. How was that journey for you, and how did that journey impact on really even how you constructed the book?
That is a wonderful question. So for me, I think I would say with that journey, like you said, medicine is obviously very, very, very important, but then I've had to like learn, well, personally for me, I feel like the crux of everything is sex education. if you don't know your body, if you don't know, just about your own existence and all of that, it's very difficult to have a strong basis in your relationships with yourself, with other people, with your parents, with your partner, with anyone. So it's like, if we don't have a strong basis, for sexual and reproductive health education, we just end up losing out and missing out on a lot in life. Because even with my work prior to Heart, like, doing work around FGM and child marriage, you tend to realize that a lot of, issues around violence stem from a lack of knowledge and a lack of understanding about bodies. I mean, there's obviously other reasons, not to sound one-dimensional, but like a lot of the time, once we have a good understanding of bodily functions and how things work out, you're less likely to fall into certain situations. And because of that, it's just learning that from my work, I realized that, okay, you know what, I want to go ahead and do research into this full-time, hence the PhD. And also just realizing that as well, like, we have this idea that Islam is so anti-sex education, when that's not the point at all. Like, with a religion that literally, like, the first words that were revealed is Ikra. So we know that, like, the basis of everything, again, is learning and knowing, and also just ensuring that when you're learning stuff that's not just factually accurate, but also it's stuff that gets you to think. And it's stuff that makes you, like, decide that, okay, you know what, maybe my point of view is not always the right one. Because even when Nabila was talking, I remembered when we were writing the part around polygamy, we didn't necessarily, I don't, like, we all are like, okay, we know that we don't really agree with polygamy, but that doesn't mean that we're just going to bypass that information, because at the end of the day, it's still very, very relevant and important information to have out there. So that's how we approached the book. It wasn't a thing of, okay, whatever we think is right is what's going to go there. Like, if we did not have the sources for something, if we could not cite it, and if we could not find, extra information around it, we couldn't just go in and put it in the book. And I think it was so helpful as well, because I was the last person to join the writing. I came in like 3 years ago to just edit. And then it ended up, like, I think when I started, we had like 100 and something pages. And by the end of it, it became the book that we had, because it ended up being this thing of like, okay, like I said, if we see this one thing and it's like, okay, we find that this is important, but like, where's the references for it? If there's no references, then how can we say that, okay, this, like, this is correct information? And also, given the kind of scrutiny that Heart is always under, we found it very, very, very important to, like, consistently have factually accurate information as well. So, and even with that information, we wanted to make sure that it was easily digestible and easily accessible as well. Because it's one thing, and coming from a world of academia, we're always like, the more complicated everything sounds, the better we think it is. But if a younger person, or someone that isn't a college graduate, or someone that does not have a lot of education, can still understand what you're saying, that's when you realize, okay, you know what, we're making sense. So we wanted to make sure that we were putting in the effort to simplify it as much as possible, but still have the resources where people could go after reading the book to find out more information. So yeah.
Yeah, that's, I mean, I can't express this strongly enough. The fact that there is such a breadth of subjects that are covered, resources that are cited and made available. I mean, I even highlighted, this is, there's an article on that, as well as the fact that it is a very straightforward read. Like, I have trouble with that. And so I sympathize with it. I basically tell people somebody else has to simplify it, because that's not where my head is. But it is very accessible. I would think that this is something that could be, even though you can't fit it in the pocket, this would be a kind of thing that I think would work across the spectrum. So from PG all the way to old fodder people like myself. There's something in here, which is an incredible feat, just to be able to do that. So it's nice to learn that that was a conscious thing, and that, there were places where you kind of had to, like, grapple with how to be factually accurate, how to have references and resources, but at the same time, make it accessible. I wanted to ask, I will come back to Nabila on this one. I wanted to ask about, actually, I'm going to ask all three of you about this, but I'm just going to ask it in different ways. Okay, so I'll start with Nabila. Because this book is so easily accessible, it seems to me that this would be an excellent reference to have for every school, including Islamic private schools. Do you guys have a proposal that you want to, put forward to have people like, kind of understand that this is a way to help teach? Now, I do have a personal story, and this is my platform, so why not I just tell it, I used to teach in an Islamic private school, and I was in charge of 4th and 5th grade girls because they divided by gender. And one reason why I was responsible was because they asked me to also teach a unit on sex education. This was in the 80s, ladies, for my master's and PhD study. I had zero knowledge except for my own experience. So I went out and did some research. I'm like, oh my goodness, they talk about that, and how to put an Islamic frame on it, but also how to be accessible to 4th and 5th graders. Personally, if you'd given me this book, I would be like, that's it, we're just going to do this book. Do you have in mind a way to be able to promote this book in actual schools so that they, will use this reference, because this Islamic values framework is in fact where this is, adding to a very unique niche?
I love this question, not just because you're asking it, but it's definitely a dream of ours. I mean, I'm sure Nadia and Hadi will agree or like have their own response to this, but we would love it for it to be in Islamic schools or in any Islamic space, to be honest, because this is really true. This is a book written by Muslims for Muslims. So it only makes sense for it to be immersed in Muslim spaces, because when we're doing the work of heart, this organization is really rooted in being able to reach the most impacted Muslims. And the most impacted Muslims are going to be in every crack and crevice of this entire world. And so that means, yes, we want it in Islamic schools. The proposal, or rather the way that we're trying to do it, is one, we are trying to create our own curriculum, actually, that we're hoping to pilot soon. And this is going to hopefully give some bit of groundedness to folks that are interested, because I think what is happening is, one, Hadi kind of mentioned this slightly, but, as an organization, we do come up against many other Muslims and Muslim organizations and Muslim communities that might not feel that they're the most aligned, or that we are the most aligned with them, right? And there are a lot of challenges that come with that, because that means we might not actually get the seat at the table, or we might not actually get the reception of Islamic schools or other Islamic spaces wanting our book in their space. And this could be a matter of several things, right? We're queer inclusive, or, we are talking about race, we're talking about all these different things that generally are not talked about. And so to be so forward and to be so bold, it really ruffles a lot of feathers. And so our hope is that we are not going to shy away, because we are trying to reach the most impacted Muslims. And that means being as inclusive as possible, being as thorough as possible. And with that, we will be piloting our own curriculum that is related exactly to the book, and really breaking down each chapter and going through and creating a series to say, this is how, in theory, it would be to teach sex education or sexual health with the Islamic framework and an Islamic perspective, and being rooted in that. So the book itself, I mean, I'm sure this is maybe going to be another question, but the book itself is not just a book that, I mean, if you wanted to, you could read it from like page 1 to the end, but it's really a workbook. It's a reflection book. It's a guide. It's all these things. It's a textbook. Like, you get to the section where it's anatomy, and you see, all these different graphics. And so when you have a book that's as dynamic as this, it requires a lot of support, in that, there are certain spaces where, again, going back to that, do you feel safe? How are you actually safe? us piloting this curriculum and this workshop series is also hoping to provide a safety net, or not a safety net, but like a safe space for folks to feel like they can also have conversations and book clubs that are aligned with that too. Because, you know, again, we're trying to make sure that we're not causing more harm. So how do we do that in a way that's, you know, going to make it so that folks are able to express themselves, feel that they're not being judged, and feel like, you know, there's a sense of belonging, which, you know, is also another one of our values that we hold dear to our hearts. So yeah, I'll stop there, and I'll let the others speak to this.
Yes, actually, anyone else who wants to respond to that? Oh, sorry, I'm still mute. No, you're mute. Anyone else wants to respond to that? Because Hadi or Nabila or Nadia? No?
I mean, Nabila did such a great job, but I think what I'll add to that is, you know, one of the, like, we at heart, we're always thinking of like, where are the directly impacted Muslims? Where are the people who could use this information the most? And oftentimes we land on college age youth. And so the curriculum that we're going to pilot, we're going to start working, you know, with Muslims on campuses and seeing how they respond. And ultimately, we want to, you know, not only pilot this curriculum, but train like a pipeline of trainers so that they can continue the work. The other place where this book is being very, very well received is social service agencies. So that particularly culturally sensitive social service agencies. So we have a number of, you know, Asian specific DV orgs or African specific orgs that are coming to us and saying, we want to buy 30 copies from you to give to our youth, or we want, you know, you to come to our after school program and, you know, and start working there. So I think that's where we're going to start. I mean, the masjids and the Islamic schools, I think it ultimately, we want it to be there. And we all, to Nabila's point about ruffling feathers, like there are a number of things in the book that I wish wasn't so uncomfortable for folks, but, you know, at the end of the day, it is. And so we're going to work with, starting with the folks that we've identified that are really excited about this book first.
Yeah. So at one point, actually, Nadia, you said something about, you know, this is a culmination. I think I was a little bit worried about that word, because culmination kind of like, okay, that's the end point. But what you're saying is the end point of certain things that, you know, have been in the pipeline for more than 7 years. So I'm really interested in, you know, kind of like, you know, where do you go from here? And I think I'm going to specifically ask Hadi about it, because obviously this focus on ilm, or knowledge, and to me, and I can tell you at 70 and 3 times retired, I see knowledge as continually unfolding, number one. And number two, I started this initiative a couple of years back in terms of queer Islamic studies and theology, because I feel that we did not grow up in our identities as Muslims with access to this kind of information as standard. And yet, I do see it as necessary at a standard level, let alone the fact that, as you mentioned, Hadi, you know, this lack of knowledge is sometimes why people become very vulnerable to unsafe situations. So where do you see sort of the next iteration, you know, either for you personally, because I'm interested in the work that you've done, you know, for example, with regard to child marriages at FGM, because when you live outside of the US, the realities of child marriage is much bigger. And the resistance to any limitations that are put on that is also very big. I mean, it's, you know, sometimes there's a logic to, you know, why they do that. But, you know, how do you see kind of like your next step with regard to what motivated you to get into this, and kind of like where are you going now with it based on your own past experiences and history.
Thank you. So honestly, I see so much for the book. So I'm very excited, first of all, that like it's, you know, it's being turned into curriculum that's going to be used on campuses. And also we get a lot of questions around like having a child-friendly version of the book. So like, you know, something for preteens or just, you know, with sex education, it's really important to be age appropriate. So starting from a smaller or a younger perspective, and then like having this book as a follow-up for them. So I think that is also something that's very, very important that I'm looking forward to. But even like, for example, I was in Gambia in October, and I took copies of the book back home as well. So I took that to nonprofits that, you know, do work around sex education, around sexual and reproductive health, and they all found it quite useful because as much as like, you know, there's some resources that's America specific, a lot of the book in itself is very global, and it's a lot of, you know, like all the coming of age stuff is just, it's the same in every context and in every country, no matter what. So I think just from my perspective, I would like to see this book and, you know, just everything else that comes from the book be used by everyone. And I would also like to sorry. I would also just, you know, enjoy seeing other versions and other iterations of the book and how we can continue to make it more inclusive and more accessible to everyone. And even from the perspective of, you know, child marriage and FGM, like you had mentioned, there's just a lot of, because of the stigmas around sex and the stigmas around sex education and reproduction in general, what you see is you know, people put their children in risky situations because they feel like it's a form of protection. But you know, once young people and parents have an understanding of what sex education actually is and how, you know, that form of education is actually what the protection is versus you know, because when I say it as a form of protection, it's usually this idea that if I marry my child off early, or if like my child goes through FGM, then they won't get pregnant at a younger age. So for them, you know, that marriage or that FGM is the form of protection that they're looking for, when in reality, the protection that they actually need is education. So with the work that Heart does and with the book, it's important to be able to use that knowledge to go into the grassroots and to sit with people and to have conversations around you know, just around issues around sex and issues around reproduction, and just making sure that we're also approaching it with in a space of grace and in a space of understanding, and not from a place that's just mental, and not from a place that we think that, oh, we know better than you, we're coming here to like inform you or tell you off, but just holding that kind of space for conversation, holding that space for nuance, which I think Heart does really well as well. So yeah.
Yes, ladies. Oh my goodness. I was gifted a digital copy before, you know, you were at your final stages. And so now I just need to ask, where is it available?
Yeah, so you can buy it directly through Amazon if that is appropriate for folks who can access Amazon or want to. We understand that there are ethical issues with Amazon, and we did do our research, and unfortunately, Amazon has kind of monopolized the self-publishing game as well. So we decided to go with Amazon, but Amazon has said that they're going to make it available in other platforms as well. So like Barnes and Noble, Walmart, Target. I haven't seen it yet there, but we did kind of sign up for that extended distribution. We're really trying to work hard to get an ebook version out there. Again, using Amazon's platform, it's not translating it perfectly because it's like so visually formatted that Amazon's kind of like messing up the formatting. So we're working on that. And I know Hadi talked about a children's version. I mean, I have so many dreams. I want this book translated. I want this book as an audio book, you know, children's version. There's just so much that we can do with this book. And this is edition 1. I want to name that too, right? Like all of the issues that we talk about in this book, literally it scratches the surface, and we could go deeper into any number of those issues for edition 2, which we will, and inshallah. But right now we want to make sure edition 1 gets the most sort of face time as possible before we move on to writing a new one.
Yeah, I just want to end, first of all, by expressing my gratitude that you showed up to do this, little friends along the way with me. But even greater than that, I do feel like you have given a wonderful gift to our communities. And I have already slated a slot in my prayer list for all of the future possibilities that you have already mentioned. I just think it's really worth it, because it looks like an intense labor and yet a labor of love. And I'm really optimistic that the wisdom that you have collaboratively brought together here will spread widely, and that one day all of us will see the end of the taboo and shaming that goes around this important topic in relationship to our own bodily integrity and our right as a human being. So I am really, really excited about the project. Any way that you think that I can assist at any time, sort of randomly, other than the fact that I will be advertising, on my different platforms, let me know, because, yeah, I wish I had had this not only when I was trying to teach a course like this in the 80s, but also because, as I said, even at the age of 70, I learned from this. So it's an amazing contribution. I'm so happy that you showed up for me, and I look forward to the future. And thank you so much.
No, thank you. I mean, I know Navila named that we uplifted female scholars, or women scholars, but without your scholarship and your peer scholarship, this book would not be what it is today. So thank you for your work as well.
Yes, thank you. I just want to add to what Nadia said, because really it's kind of an ode to the work that you guys have already done. So we're literally just continuing on from, your hard work. So thank you for having us.